We're here today to talk about the Morlocks, those mutants that live under the subway, under the city, that live hidden from humans because of various reasons. Because of various reasons, that's today we're gonna explore the way that they relate to like passing, disability, queerness, and a lot of other stuff. And we're gonna talk about like how uh, this the Morlocks play in all of these things and how they have been used in different brands. And for that, we have three amazing guests. We have Anthony Oliveira, Mea Copa
That's me.
in Twitter. Anthony has written some Marvel stories. I always like to like highlight that little story in this surprise between Magneto and Iceman because it's an absolute one
Oh,
favorite.
thank you. Yeah, I've
Like,
written all of 5 X-Men pages, and that's them. So thank you so
yeah,
much.
what a pages! What pages! So like,
If you can only pick five, those are the five I think you should
Yeah.
pick.
Oh, thank you. That makes
exactly.
me. I'm blushing. I'm so touched. Thank you so much.
That's our professional opinion. And we also have Cineat Kinney, a writer and women writes about comics, and another bunch of like media, like pages and stuff, including comic works with articles on like trans issues, liminality of marginalization. Jesse Drake, we have a show on Jesse Drake that we did a while ago. You also watch it, and a bunch of other things. So very excited for Cinia to be here as well. And we have Scott Yar. Oh wait, the handler of Cinead is trans race. All the handlers are gonna be on the screen later, but anyway. Uh, we also have Scott Yar, aka Marvel Morlocks in Twitter, and he's like someone that explores neurodiversity within comics and specifically related to the Morlocks. So this is gonna fall right into what we're gonna talk about today. And as far as usuals, we got Travis over there, and we got Seal, and we got Gabriel and me. And I don't know if all of you handlers. Travis is the same like Travis Hedgehog. Seal, I think, is Priya Writes or something like that. But you
Letters of Freya. Yeah.
Wright is on Priya. Okay, almost. And Gabriel is Mark Jesus, I feel. And I
Yes.
don't have a handler, it's just Watch the Mutants. Eh, so with all of that, let's go for it.
This week on Mutant Watch.
Okay, so I'm really excited to talk about this. So where to begin? Um, how like the first question would be, how does every one of you relate to the Morlocks? Like, why do you connect with them as characters? Because like some of these characters have appeared in like one panel or two. Some of these characters are like more a vibe than a character. So like, but we love them, and and I want to know like the various reasons that you are like, oh yes, the Morlocks. I feel them in my soul. That's the question. I think it's a very good question. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. Why not? For me, I think I related to the Morlocks before I knew I related to the Morlocks. Simply because of their kind of position as a little bit on the outside, which as someone who was queer before they realized they were queer, it was something I can definitely It's something that I experienced a lot while growing up. Plus, there is just something cool about a lot of the Morlocks who are able to draw so much focus despite not doing anything. I have been obsessed with Tommy for the majority of my life, and I cannot think of a single thing that woman has ever said. But it doesn't matter. I would sacrifice most of the X-Men for more Tommy panel time. What is her power even? I'm not even 100% sure. She has cool hair and she turns two-dimensional, maybe? I think she did that once in her only appearance on the TV show. So, but it's like you said, some of them are just more of a vibe than they are anything else, and I am down with Tommy's vibe.
I'll go next, I guess. I think that I was born nonverbal, so I was not a big communicator as a child. And so all the communication I have now is decades of work to get here. At 43, it's been a long walk. And I think that some of the characters like Artie and Leech, they're not huge communicators through words, but they have a huge amount of fandom because of the energy and the relationships they espouse with other characters through supporting roles. From like Future Foundation with Franklin, all the way back through their original appearances in some of the cartoons and some of the and Generation X, which was a team that came out in the 90s. I think that being queer back in the 90s was already kind of like an outsider position. But even within the community itself, being neurodiverse can be complex to navigate when you're open about that level of neurodiversity with like autism and not being verbal. It's very disconcerting because you're different. And with the Morlocks, they had a very visual representation to their mutation beyond their mutation, which separated them. And so for me, that was like always a very connective part, is that even within marginalized communities, there's still, you know, stratification and different levels of classes. And I didn't always feel that I fit into the particular role that others expected.
I'll piggyback on that. I feel like I came to the Morlocks kind of out of that, a similar interest in the sort of like stratification of like a marginalized community. Like there are really poignant like comparisons to like the role or like the position of the trans community within the sort of like quote unquote LGBTQIA plus community. And so like they represent like a form of marginalization within a marginalized group. And I think that really as a trans woman who like has a contested relationship with the idea of passing, let alone like the embodiment of passing, that kind of outsider status within a group of outsiders has always just felt really close to home. Like, you know, the mutants themselves are this marginalized group, but within that there are these like sub marginalities where, you know, mutants who don't pass or like choose not to pass, or, you know, for whatever reason, like they don't fit into the sort of like, not to say conservative, but like a more like flat scan friendly version of mutation.
Assimilationist, yeah.
Yeah.
Homogenized.
Yeah.
Palatable.
Okay, so since Anthony brought up assimilation, I'm not gonna I'm gonna cannonball into the waters that I was gonna tiptoe into. I think like I've always been really interested in those kind of like trans like separatist movements where you know, there is like a rejection of like the way that cis normativity plays into the trans experience, and the ways that like our, even just like the language we use, the way we embody ourselves, the way we conceive of ourselves has so much baggage with like a cis normative culture. And so I really always can empathize with folks who reject that form of assimilation and are trying to carve something out in response to and as like a rejection to that idea of assimilation. And so there's that. And, you know, Callisto is also just like exactly gender goals for me, and so she's got plenty of leather and switchblades to, it doesn't matter how many times she's actually the focus of a story, she'll always be like near and dear to my heart.
I could go next. I think I have a lot in parallel. What attracts me to the Morlocks is a lot of the things that Sinead was just saying, that like this question of assimilation. I mean, to me, the Morlocks are about this very late 80s, early 90s kind of punk queerness. That is not just a queerness, right? That speaks to like, again, like disability and all these other forms that just reject a model of fitting in. I was reading the Morlocks the same time. I grew up obsessed with Phantom of the Opera as a kid, and like all of the early Morlock stories reference Phantom of the Opera very directly, right? Like the Caliban story with Kitty, the beat of Callisto abducting Warren. Like there is a kind of, well, fuck you, I'm ugly and you don't want me, and I'm going to take out this kind of punk revenge on the world that doesn't appreciate me, that really speaks to me with the Morlocks. And this way that it engages questions of passing is interesting to me. The flat version of it is always like, these are the mutants that didn't fit in. But what I find really interesting is there are several of them that could pass, right? Like Anna Lee could pass, Callisto could pass. And the ultimate Bliss passes, right? Like that's the whole point of Bliss, is like, look at how easy it is to look the way you look. And the apotheosis of this that should really break that whole metaphor, but actually makes it so much cooler, is Mask, right? They have the resource to pass if they want to, and they reject it. And they've sort of built a community that insists on something much more radical and more interesting. Like they not only don't fit into the norm that Charles Xavier is trying to create, they actively reject it and are now trying, from this disadvantaged, impoverished position, to create a counterculture. I find that fascinating and interesting as a character and as a modality to bring these stories into dialogue with.
Yeah, what everyone else is saying, I really, it's kind of the same for me, because like the Morlocks are sort of like the weirdos of the weirdos, and like for me, like my experience is like, so it's like I am lesbian and I am like not white and I have autism, and so there's like a lot of weird things about me, I guess. And so it's like even in the communities of like where you expect people to understand your experiences, like sometimes some of them don't always understand or sympathize with you, and so it's like you have to carve out your own space of people who are like, who will accept you, like even the stranger parts of you, and who will like support you in that. And so that's why like the Morlocks are really important to me, and I think they challenge the X-Men in some really interesting ways.
Yeah, I think it really spoke to me when I was a kid. We grew up dirt poor, for one thing, and so seeing poor characters was always a novel thing. But also, a lot of the communities that I grew up in, there's a lot of BSing to make up for not having anything. And so, like, my aunt lived in the Tenderloin in the 80s above a gay bar, and there were always guys at the bar that were like, we have our own law, we have our own, culture, and we have our own way of doing things. And it was like, yeah, but you also still have to pay off the police. And, you go to the reservation, and the AIM War had just been lost, but there was still all this talk of, well, we have our own government, we have our own way of this. And it's sort of true, and it's also sort of bullshit you tell yourself because you got nothing, because you lost. And so when I was looking at like early comics, and I think I first came to the Morlocks in X-Men Classic, like the reprints. And you could see that kind of swagger, but you could also tell like it's kind of BS. Like their real agenda is we're going to kidnap a pretty person and put them in leather. And that's our culture. Like, that's our whole, their whole kind of culture was fuck you, we're getting something. We can do something. And so that meant a lot. I still have issue with selective mutism sometimes. And so Artie and Leech were like a big thing for me as a kid. So there was that aspect of it as well. But I also like to get mad at the Morlocks. Like I wasn't like a Morlock stan. Like I would, especially when the cartoon came around, like I would get annoyed with the Morlocks. And I enjoyed it.
I think that kind of sums up X-Men fandom as a whole. We like to get mad at it and enjoy it.
Yeah. It's cathartic. That's how we see parts of ourselves in it that frustrate us, and it brings out that frustration, and it works like a mirror to force us to self-actualize around things we're not necessarily comfortable with. But it's in an allegory situation, so it doesn't feel as personal and gives us sometimes more emotional space or more chemical emotional space to be able to deal with that rather than in the moment with other people. We can do it kind of like on our own time in our own way.
I'm just thinking about the ways they kind of activate, like the way they echo with things like ball culture or like radical fairy movements, or like they're the kinksters of the mutant community, where like the kids on Twitter are like, no, we're not like that, please. Like we're the good ones, and the Morlocks just have like a fuck you, we're gonna do like, you're never going to accept us anyway, is what the Morlocks understand, that, you know, Xavier and the Puritans at the mansion don't understand. Like there's never going to be a moment where you're going to accept us. And that's what I really like about the implication of Callisto's backstory, which we never quite get, was that, like, we know she's horrified at the idea of looking like the beautiful person she used to look like, because that's what Danny makes her see. And again, like, she has access through Mask to look like, he punishes her at one point by making her pass again. And so I love this idea of like the recognition, the true recognition that they will never accept us, and they don't even have the mutant, like the power resources of the Xavier students, right? It's like, I'm a flat lady, I like I ooze slime. Like they don't have, and that's why they're not interpolated into the Magneto versus Xavier conflict, right? Because they are not useful soldiers. I find that very interesting. Like that is a much more realistic, like, what happens if you're not an Omega? What happens if the kids aren't talking about how great Tommy's feats are, you know? Like, what does it mean to be markedly different and not also receive, well, at least I'm a fucking badass who has these mutant magnetic powers or something? Like, then what? I like that as a question that the text is begging.
That's why I love Artie.
And like Callisto stabbing people, she's the leader because that is the best power they have.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Her knives are, I mean,
They also have the most, like, I'm fascinated by Healer, right? Like a character who, again, has no backstory we understand, seems to just pass, seems to just be an old man, and yet he has easily the most useful power of anybody in X-Men lore, because he's like constantly saving people from death.
Up until Elixir, he was what they had.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yet, because he's not combative, he doesn't fit into the superhero model, so we know almost nothing about him. I find that interesting.
I feel like
I think... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I had been thinking about the kind of like quote unquote power sets of the Morlocks recently, and it's interesting that we bring this up because, like, when I think about it, like, most of, I mean, with a few exceptions, they don't have, like, their mutations really take place as mutations rather than like quote unquote power sets. Like, they are not, like, both in their culture and in the way that the characters are constructed, like, they stand as such like a rejection of the sort of like militarization of just like mutation in general that you know, the Magneto and Xavier relationship kind of like sort of necessitates about mutants. Like you are mutation is thought of as like its capability in a fight in terms of like raw, and that's just like superhero comics in general. But I appreciate that like the X-Men hold space for like, here are just people whose mutation is like it has no quote unquote productivity, and
or
it
it's
serves
anti-productive, right? Like Leech.
Yeah. And it's just like it's pure difference without having this like, you know, like it's interesting to think about the mutant metaphor when you're Magneto and you can pull a satellite out of orbit to throw at the White House if you had wanted to. Like that's one mutant metaphor, but like, yeah, like what if you're just like super bright colored or like, you know, what if you communicate through illusions mostly and like mental projections? Like it's such a unique way to think about mutation that I've always also loved, that like it creates an opportunity to see mutation as something other than just like a way to, you know, engage in violent resistance, which has its place, but also it's, you know, nice to see the counter to that.
Well, I think oh, go ahead.
No. Okay, I was just going to say it definitely does take the mutant metaphor into a more realistic place, because they are different. They are noticeably different. They are prosecuted against. But then, unlike the X-Men and the Brotherhood and all these other people, they don't have this inherent power that they could stop it. Maybe not in a widespread place, but at least in that moment, you know, if Sabretooth is being chased by an angry mob, he can choose to not be chased at any point. You know, someone like Artie doesn't have that option.
Yeah. I think that the Morlocks have to be, even before you get to like Gene Nation or whatever, they have to be more aware that they are political. Their existence is political. Whereas a lot of the X-Men, a lot of like the Brotherhood or whatever, I think will insist against that. I don't think Wolverine thinks everything he does is political, even when he's like being a CIA agent. Toad is doing whatever. Toad's not thinking this is political, this is personal, this is you know. And I think the Morlocks, because of their socioeconomical situation and because they're not the mutants that are on the news, I think they have to be more aware everything they're doing is political. The way that they get their food is political. The way that they spend their day is political, in a way that the other characters, I think, just they're really living in superhero world.
Yeah, I think that's something that Sina Grace's Iceman addressed really well, and I kind of wish that series had gone on a little longer, but I think what it did with the Morlocks was really interesting.
I like that. I mean, to this point, like their existence is also politicized in the sense that we understand them as a culture, right? Like within the space of the story, we understand the hierarchy of their system and like ways to challenge that hierarchy in ways that an autocrat like Magneto simply doesn't do, right? Like it is one of the rare moments, just shocking to say when you think about how long this series has been running, but easy to understand when you think about the fact that it's mostly been written by cis, white, straight men, that you only have these flashpoints of mutant culture, right? Like Grant Morrison notably creates a moment where we understand culture is emerging as a response. And you have Grant as a queer person putting in characters like Jumbo Carnation, characters who are telling us about what it means to exist as a mutant culturally in this space. You can think about mutant art for a moment. I'm interested in these moments, like Magneto's Genosha as a culture has always interested me as a text we don't really get to see, but as a space where, as opposed to Krakoa, which is in this kind of permanent vacation mode, like Magneto's Genosha was an urbanized, industrialized space. What does that mean? What did that look like is something I would really have loved to know. And the Morlocks are all of that, but without the resources that those
Yeah.
represented, right? And that fascinates me.
Like I guarantee the Morlocks have the best parties on Krakoa,
Oh,
but they
Oh,
also they don't
hands
they
down.
don't go to Blob's bar. Like Blob has the only bar on the island, which drives me nuts. But it's like the Morlocks don't go to Blob's bar. They're not going to the gala events, but they're definitely having the best parties.
yeah. They have a music, I'm sure. They have an
Yeah.
art. I mean, and that's what's interesting about characters like Artie, right? Where it is about, which I just realized now after 20 years is a pun, his name, but like,
There you go.
like, what does it mean when your ways of living and communicating are different than the rest of the world? Well, it might look like this, right? And that's really fascinating to think about. I also, my favorite Morlock is Anna Lee. A problematic character, but like this person who is endlessly trying to reconstitute the trauma of family loss that seems to
I'm
be.
waiting for her and Nanny to meet up.
Yeah,
That's
they're-
where my story
yeah.
is. I mean, I think that these two ladies with the Bowery have like a real mini just waiting to happen.
yeah, there is a kind of, there's a way that both those characters actually tap into a very old tradition and anxiety, like the changeling baby, right? I was talking about radical fairiness, like the idea that the people on the margins will steal your babies, right? Anna Lee is an expression of that, and that's why it would be nice, and so is Nanny and Orphan Maker, and it would be nice to see that interrogated too. Yeah.
I definitely think that there is a lot of potential now that Krakoa is a thing, and like you said, with the mutant culture, because the Morlocks have had it, because they didn't have that focus on productivity, on usefulness. So it's more likely that there's going to be Morlocks who have contributed to art or to music with their powers. It's a lot like a well of narrative that they could touch if the writers would go there.
I also like the Splinter group with Mask and them. That's just like, dude, you guys are dealing with Sinister. Sinister's a fucking Nazi. We're not dealing with it. We're heading to Madripoor. Peace out. Like, I get that. Like, I get that. I was like, okay, so all the pretty kids have their own little island. They're partying all the time. Good for you. I got slaughtered. The next thing I know, I'm waking up here, and you're telling me that the dude who had me slaughtered gave you my genes so I could be reincarnated. I'm gonna need a moment. I'm gonna need some space. I'll see y'all in about 6 to 9 months.
Well, there's so many. I mean, there's so many genocides in the X-Men comics. Like the Proud Star family, their whole res got genocided.
Boom.
While one of them was dead. He's alive now, so I'm waiting for that one where he's like, oh shit, everyone's fucking dead, huh? Okay. But the Morlocks are slaughtered, and then they go to Krakoa, and there's so many supremacists and genocidal demagogues who they just straight gave power to. And that's gotta be like, if I got invited to Krakoa, there's no way in hell. Like, I'm not like super national America, whatever, but there's no way in hell I would go live on Krakoa the minute I was like, so who's your government? Like, well, these 3 Nazis and Jean Grey.
Right. And a bunch of Omega level mutants, right? Like, it is a powered, like, why do you have to be, it doesn't make, there's no reason that the Quiet Council needs to all be like high Omega level mutants. They're all, not all very passing, but mostly passing or pleasant to look at, right? Like, there's no Glob Herman is not there.
Interesting when we're talking about like Morlocks that are influential, that if they came back, how they would kind of change the game. You know what's an interesting check would be Quarty, if you guys ever read that. She's Seer on Destiny.
Oh, yeah.
Because she's not even a minor Seer. She was pretty hardcore. So she is one of those mutants that could easily be, and because we're bringing back our like forecasters, right? We've already seen Blindfold showing up in Legion of X coming up. Cordy's another one of those characters who's like a pretty solid mutant seer. There was an entire arc about their diaries, their books, and seeing that kind of comparison in towards Destiny. Because I mean, I know everybody ships Destiny and Mystique, love them too, but I don't trust them.
I only trusted them as long as I needed them to get rid of Moira. Now that that's done, I just need them to get rid of Xavier, and then I'm not going to trust them.
I'm still
Yeah,
distracted.
the mission's never
thinking-
over, is it? There's always one more. That's what they tell you to sell themselves. Be careful on that.
I'm still distracted thinking about what if Annalie and Nanny kissed, but like she kissed the egg.
So, kind of tying that in, I think the way that we move away from Mystique and Destiny being all morally ambiguous power couple lesbians is we need Annalie and Nanny to become our morally ambiguous
Close out.
power couple lesbians.
I support this. That's a good story.
The real like arsenic and old lace thing
Yeah.
there. That would be fun.
Okay, so aside from the fact that I didn't answer my own question, because you all were doing amazing, I I connected for very similar reasons to what you all are said, especially the thing about like the class thing, because like there's very few superhero comics in which like poor people are main part of the comics, and that is expressed in a ways that you can see how that affects how they live. That's pretty unusual. That's what drives me a lot to a lot of Morlock stories, and especially because they have problems that are affected by that class. Like they can't get they just don't have like a school, like the school of the rich kids that can like be protected from the war. If they suffer, like if someone is going after them, they're hella vulnerable. And
Yeah.
that shows incredibly in the Mutant Massacre event. It's like the pinnacle of that. And also like you all were talking about the passing stuff, the like acceptability politics, the depending on how you look, people are gonna accept you or not, and you can't always choose how you look or behave. Sometimes you can choose that. Sometimes that's something, or you can't afford to choose that. And those are the things that like drove me there. And I will take advantage of this to ask you all if you have any Morlog story that you would recommend that would touch on some issues that you think are important. Because one of the things with the Morlocks is that I have mainly read them through Uncanny X-Men, through like the arcs in which they appear. But I'm curious to see if anyone else has any particular story that is like, oh, this story is very good for this thing.
I thought a lot about. Oh,
No, you go.
I thought a lot about whether or not to recommend the Jeff Johns Morlocks miniseries. It's a 4-issue mid 2000s run, and it doesn't feature any Morlocks that we've ever seen. It's like it's a group of 4, and I know Shatter. This is where Shatter comes from.
Chicago.
Yes, Chicago. And they're at the end they're resolving to like head to New York, I believe, but we never
correct.
actually see them. It's a really imperfect story, but I also like there are some really interesting gems in there, specifically about stratification. And I'm thinking specifically of one of the characters who is. They don't get too specific about his profession, but he was like a CEO, had a sort of like very fancy job, had the car, had the penthouse, and like mutation surfacing when it did in the ways that it did, like re-stratified this person's experience of class. And I thought that was really interesting because, we see a lot of mutants at different social classes, but it's maybe a little bit rarer where we see mutation destabilize their experience of class. Like, I think a lot about Warren, who like is rich and a mutant. And then there are characters who are like rich despite being mutants or because they're mutants. But like, it's just a really interesting story to see how this one aspect of marginality like fundamentally restructured the privilege that a person had. And like how that person's privileges still played out with in terms of how they relate to the other characters. That said, it's a mini written by Jeff Johns, and so like several grains of salt. It's also like an early 2000s comic, and so there are portrayals of sex work that like aren't exactly affirming.
Right.
You know, all the caveats that it sounds like an early 2000s Jeff John series would have to have.
I think that's where Postman comes from as well, who's like one of the few black telepaths we ever see like ever anywhere, which is interesting as well, like how they used him in that role.
Yeah, it's also a really it's a very simple story about, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it's a very simple story.
I'm right there with you. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And it has a sort of scale for the stakes that are really personal and like really just compelling, but not these like unrelatable, you know, missiles being thrown, Avengers versus X-Men, or X-Men fighting, you know, against sentient space gods or the Technarch. Like it's a really human story, and I think for that reason it's really nice to see them, the Morlocks as an idea, get that level of attention when they're not being like slaughtered off screen, which is like their biggest claim to fame is that they were butchered in a very popular run, Mutant Massacre, which is just like, you know, it's the perfect, that story is like a perfect crystallization of like why I think they haven't been done right. Is like their biggest and most notable story is really them serving as like furniture, like their cannon fodder to tell stories about the other X-Men. And the suffering that they go through is framed in terms of how other X-Men are responding to it. How is Storm responding to it? How is how are the new mutants as kids responding to it? But they spend so much less time about like, you know, what is the psychology of Callisto watching all of her people get murked, knowing that she's not the leader, but feeling that responsibility. And yeah, I feel like those would be my two recommendations.
I do think, and this is a huge topic that I don't even know how to fully go into, but I think it says a lot about our society in real life that the most marginalized people in a marginalized group of people, their only use is as victims. And I think that says a whole lot.
I was going to recommend Exterminators for a totally different reason, because you get Rusty and Skids, you get WizKid, you get Artie and Leech. I mean, love the cast. You got demons, you got babies, you got like wild hijinks, and it's one of the few stories where you actually get to see Morlocks kind of living their best lives, like getting stuff done, like that they're doing the work and they're looking out for their community and they're doing it from a different place than you normally see with X-Men. It's only 4 issues, really short. But it's one of my favorite little minis. And Day Trippers is kind of like another one that it's only a 3-issue spin-off from Gen X. It's what this shirt right here is about. But it's kind of like, it's a romp. I think that often we see kind of like these characters narratively as suffering, these characters narratively as being used as foils for other protagonists in a more important way. But in these 2 minis, they really, like Artie and Leech kind of steal the show in Day Trippers. And I love that for them because you know, being able to teleport through different realities with two different people who are nexuses of reality, and kids just living their best life on a fun little vacation while everyone else is dealing with Bastion, zero tolerance, and you know, the rest of the team is floating on in the middle of the ocean by themselves. It was a lot of fun for me then, and I think that it's fun to read about them living their best lives rather than in a kind of suffering scenario.
Yeah, and what I love about Exterminators is that, like, it's an ensemble cast, but, like, when you look at the story, like, when you look at the protagonist of the story, it's Taki, WizKid, and he's a disabled character, and, like, he has a mutation, and, like, that helps him, adjust for his, disability, but it doesn't, like, erase his disability, like, he still, like, can't stand. So, I think it's really nice how that series, like, features that character, and also it's written by Louise Simonson and drawn by John Bogdanov, and that's just a really great.
It's also like that piece with Taki is like probably the most, like, it's just such a poetically concise like case study and like a social model for disability as well, in terms of like, if you want to explain the social model of disability to a comics fan, I feel like just give them that those few pages of Taki explaining his chair, and like it I don't know, like just the way that like they have a like this kid talk about like the positionality of like disabled bodies in response to an ableist society as like the root of the issue, and not like, it's just I'm thinking about it now and I'm just like, please read Exterminators, if only for that, but there's also so much there.
Yeah,
Well, I
there's,
think
I think Boom Boom and Richter getting their new clothes, and like Richter's outfit is like gay, I think, and that's fun.
Yeah. I think Taki and Chance in Fallen Angels, both, they fall in that Morlock political end of the spectrum for me. And those were my X-Men characters. I was kind of turned off by the current X-Men when I was a kid that was running. The latter half of the Claremont stuff, none of these characters meant anything to me. I couldn't get into it. But Chance was a big one from Fallen Angels, and Taki from Exterminators. And I like that Exterminators treats the Morlocks, the New Mutants, and the X Factor kids as like distinct subcultures, as distinct little households, basically. They're not just, it's the mute way of doing things. Like, they clearly live in different circumstances.
I'm also going to do something that's really expected from my persona and say that a really good Morlock story, even though it's not organized under, like, this character is not a Morlock, is not presented as a Morlock, but Jesse Drake's story, I think, like, pitch perfect assessment of, like, the Morlock experience, and the way that just, like, just how that experience of disenfranchisement as a marginalized member of a marginalized community just like plays out in this like another framing. And like Jesse's story, I can't not read it as a part of like the Morlocks canon, because it just has that same, I feel like it has that same kind of like threat and inherent politicization, like this trans homeless youth just like struggling against a world that itself is like very anti-mutant. I almost said anti-trans, probably, but it's I consider it to be like a Morlock story because it has that same like sort of political narrative about just like the way that these mutants get lost. Like, so much of it is framed by like Wolverine is sent to find Jesse by Xavier, and then both Xavier and Wolverine just say fuck it the second like Ghost Rider and like two other heroes show up, and it becomes just like a pissing contest over like which dude can gaslight Typhoid Mary the most.
Typhoid Mary.
And then they forget about Jesse Drake, the reason that Wolverine came into this story in the first place. And it just speaks to the way that like the dominant structures of mutant power just like overlook this kind of like sub-marginalized class.
I think that, I mean, I really have as problematic as they are, I have a great fondness for the original. Like I was rereading Mutant Massacre for this and like crying too much last night. So like those are great. But I do think, and this speaks to what Sinead was just saying, but from the opposite perspective, perhaps, the X Factor story where we actually see Artie's origin is, to me, a lot. It is, because Artie is an interesting problem because he's one of the few Morlocks we actually do get an origin story for. We see him slip through the cracks and become a Morlock, and his narrative is actually surprisingly proleptic given the dialogue we've had in the intervening decades about organizations like Autism Speaks, right? Like Artie's origin is that his father means very well and wants to cure Artie of what's wrong with Artie and teach Artie how to speak and fix his problems. And the story is very much about the violence of these attempts to cure people. And it's not couched in the usual way I think of these things as like a queered story. It's actually much closer to like an autistic or a disability story, where it's just like your attempt to fix me is doing me a great violence. And I think it also has like a nice slow build to it. It gets tied into the Hank McCoy of it all, which is a lot of these issues tend to concentrate. Like Hank is the ultimate sort of self-hating, like I need to cure myself. And his story is run in parallel to Artie's, which is really neat to read. It's a good series of beats in X Factor. The Morlocks are in X Factor a lot if you haven't taken a look at it, including like the Morlocks who are hated even by the Morlocks because they're actually literally radioactive and like being around them will kill you. Like that's a neat problem to watch the mutant community deal with too. Those would be my recs.
So to go back to Daydreamers for just a second, I like Daydreamers and it's a sweet series. There's a part in that where they're in different realities and they meet a genderqueer Doctor Strange. And Franklin Richards is weird about it. And I'm like, okay, Franklin Richards is like a little yuppie kid. Okay. But Artie and Leech are weirded out by it. And I'm like, nah, like even like back in the day as a teacher, I was like, I don't buy it. I don't buy that that's throwing them off. That Doctor Strange is in a dress is like too much for the Morlock kids.
That was the Glenda the Good Witch.
Yeah, and that writer had also written he's done some good gender stuff or interesting gender stuff, but he also wrote a very transphobic Daredevil villain who was forcibly transed, and it ruined her, mentality, making her think she was a man kind of thing, which is just was disgusting in the 90s. It's more disgusting in retrospect, but it was like right at the same time as that Doctor Strange moment. And so as going back, like in my mind, like as a kid, that was just like, I could sort of see some characters. I can't see the Morlock kids have an issue there.
Yeah, because I mean, their leader is Callisto.
Yeah.
Literally.
There's a lot of gender going on there. So
I guarantee you,
Callisto's gender is Callisto.
Lives. It's
So one storyline that I would recommend, like, it's really a Morlock story, but it's about a Morlock, and it's just the storyline of Marrow joining the X-Men, and just like everything about her character. I think like her adjusting to being a part of the X-Men, and then like sort of rethinking her past ideas, but still like holding on to it. There's like it's it's really interesting from like a queer perspective and like a disability perspective, I think. And she's just a character that's very dear to me, so I would recommend her storyline.
How do folks feel about The Gifted?
The TV show?
Yeah, because I think about if somebody were to be like, what's the best way to like drink in this idea of the Morlocks? I would feel like before any of the comics would hit my mind, I would think about the second season of Gifted, and just sort of like the very kind of ham-fisted but still fairly like it has a lot of heart, just like the story that Blink goes on in that second season with that version of the Morlocks. And I'm always curious to hear other people's thoughts of like how they approach that idea of the Morlocks versus like what we see in the comics, especially the leader being Erg instead of Callisto.
When it comes to most things with the Gifted, their handling of the Morlocks, I do have a very biased view on it, because putting it next to our other live adaptation version of the Morlocks, which was X3, which I don't think could have been done worse. So in comparison, it was immaculate. So I'm trying to think back and kind of remove that from it and see what my opinion is on it. But I'm still coming back to better than X3.
I have not seen that show. So who is Erg?
Erg is he the one with the like
Yeah.
electric
Correct.
eye? Yeah, he has
Yeah,
like
he
an
is.
eye patch,
Yeah.
and underneath it he's like
Laser eye. Well, electric
Laser
eye,
Cyclops.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like half
yeah.
Cyclops, and it
Yeah.
hits the ground and it travels to whoever it is by connecting bioenergy and shocks their immune system or shocks their nervous system.
I also didn't get to season 2 because I couldn't get past like I kept waiting for the Fenris thing to drop. I was like, why are they Fenris? Like I don't understand why these are the Struckers, but
Neither did the writers.
yeah, I was like, is there a point where this rug is gonna come out? And it just never did. And I was like, I don't understand what's happening here. I imagine it's Erg because of Last Stand. Like it's probably Erg because they had used Callisto in Last Stand, and so they weren't allowed to use. Yeah, so they weren't allowed to use the character, is what I would suspect. For legal reasons would be the reason. But I liked the bits in season 1 that are about like, listen, we're just gathering community. We don't have a Cerebro. We don't have a mansion we inherited. We're just gonna like squat in this building. I do think like the boots on the groundness of the show appealed to me. If you're saying it's worth trying to struggle through into season 2, maybe I should do that.
I personally think yes. Gifted is a very weird take on the X-Men because they center a rich white family.
Yeah, that
It-
was.
It is a weird choice that they made, but it's a lot of wake up to your privilege. So I can somewhat tolerate.
Is it the Fenry twins? Are they the focus?
It's a different Fenris
It's
twins.
like descendants of the Fenris twins.
Mine just
It's just like, and it just, I watched like 10
Like, is
episodes. I
this
was like, are we
Dallas
ever
with
going to talk
Nazis?
about
I will say this, they do eventually acknowledge the original Fenris twins and that they were every kind of bad person possible.
So it's thinking of, that's almost interesting to me. Like the idea that you would be like, our heroes have to deal with like the ultimate like white privilege problem, right? Like, I guess it's a bold choice.
It's a choice.
I like watching
I'll
Amy
leave it
Acker
there.
do things. She's great. So maybe I should give it another go. But
I've never watched The Gifted, I'll be honest, so I don't have an opinion on it.
Okay, so for the next thing, I'm just gonna ask you all how you see. We have already kind of talked about this during the show, but how you see the potential of the Morlocks as a concept to be used as a narrative to further explain, not explain, but like so marginalized groups. And here I'm thinking, we have talked about like how there are very like few of the mutants that are poor are Morlocks. Like there's a class difference between them and the X-Men, but also there's like layers of them being what we would consider disabled in the way that they represent different ways. Some of them are explicitly disabled in some ways, and some of them are like mutant power disabled. And also in how, if any way, you all see that adds into like the queerness of the Morlocks. How to see the Morlocks like as a queer. I sometimes imagine it as like kind of queer commune type of thing because like in contraposition to, and we're gonna talk about this later, but in contraposition to Krakoa, for example, which is more of like, for me, it feels more like an homonationalist state. If we're gonna go the queer route, this feels more like a queer commune because it has the elements of we don't have everything we need. We need to create something for each other, and it's not based on like we have drugs and international relationships and shit like that. It's based on like how can a community of people take care of each other when they're all so different? And that's a very broad question, but just to see if any of you all have thoughts on any of those things.
I've actually
Well, I
been
mean-
thinking. Oh,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I've been thinking a lot about. I think it's Sophie Campbell's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and just the way that like that series is highlighting. I came to it because a friend of mine, Alex, if you're listening, thank you for the recommendation. It was stellar. But we were talking about like mutual aid within comics, and you know, it was pitched to me as kind of like a souped up version of like the Morlocks narrative, but given space to breathe, and grappling with like action and like kind of like classic kid comic things, but also like what does it mean to build a community? Like what does it mean to show up? Like what does community actually mean? Like it's not just a bunch of people who find themselves in proximity to each other, but what does it mean about your responsibility to others, about the responsibility of how resources are used? And in reading through, I'm so disjointed in the run, so I don't want to like upset any fans of Sophie Campbell's work by like butchering it, but like as I understand, they are kind of like reeling from a sort of communal trauma from a bunch of folks being sort of forcibly mutated and something happening in the city that like destabilized a lot of like people's ability to access like the resources that help them get their needs met. And I think that that would be the most interesting way to sort of see the Morlocks fleshed out, is like almost counter to Krakoa, where it's like, here is this like, you know, here is this like vacation spot island run by at least a few Nazis. But like for the folks who can't get there or don't want to get there, like for the folks that Krakoa isn't the solution, like the mutant community just says like, fuck that, and leaves those people to fend for themselves. And so I would love to see like Morlock stories that allow them to explore like, what do you, like, how do you build community? How do you handle these relationships? How do you struggle against like the threat that, and I think about this a lot just like as a trans person right now, like how do we handle intercommunity conflict and harm, especially within the frame of like mass mobilization of like literally just like a state-run eugenics program being ramped up against trans people. And so like I've been thinking about these things, like how do you handle your own shit within your community when like the world around you is also trying to like handle your shit for you? And these are things that I think like the Morlocks, more than any other characters in the X-Men, are really well positioned to start like working through, because they have that boots on the ground experience. They have that scale of like their problems aren't going to be, you know, fighting Nimrod or whatever is going on in Lives of Wolverine, but it's going to be like, you know, how do we make sure that this person has like medicine? Like, how do we make sure that like this person can get to work safely? Like, I like that scale allows them to tell really interesting stories that could pull on the mutant metaphor in ways that Marvel hasn't really been brave enough to do so, while they're, you know, again, letting like murderers and you know, habitual serial rapists and groomers like pilot Krakoa. So
It's a choice.
it's yeah.
Yeah, and the scale of their lives is also, I mean, it's more familiar to the scale of like my life, right? Where it's like, I'm never going to be in a position to tell the UN to fuck off, you know? like the Krakoa fantasy is a fantasy. Like most communities, with a very few, I mean, notable exceptions in human history, don't get to found their own separatist state. It is not something within our realm of horizon of being, but dealing with, for example, like, well, what do I do when I'm in conflict with a member of my own community? Or what does it mean to be in dialogue with an elder in my community, right? Like that's one of the other things the Morlocks have that Xavier and Magneto don't really have going on, which is like, Anna Lee kidnapped some kids. Her mind's not great. How do we as a community deal with this, right? Like that's an interesting question to engage. It's similarly an interesting question to think about, like, well, how do we allocate resources to each other? How do we foster not just like their experience is my experience, where it's like, I'd have to think for a minute about the last time I talked to like a cis straight person, like, but they yet still their community interfaces with regular mainline communities, right? They are not in the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific. They are not where Genosha was. They are in New York, mostly with each other, but trying to get resources from the community around them. The only other cases I can think of that are like Mutant Town, which is again like it exists in its own problematic book, but like that is the kind of model of community that I think is actually much more realistic for how mutancy would deal with itself, which is like the queer experience, where it's like, well, I got to get out of this small town, get into a city and find my people. And we're going to have to, that does mean cutting myself off from like generational wealth and like the resources of the community that was supposed to raise me, that gave me up. But it will put me into positions with elders and with younger people. Leeches, like I like that about the Morlock story. Sorry, but yeah, I'm that's a long way of saying I agree.
Well, I think that's a problem with the way that the X-Men tone has developed, is even when you have generations, we don't really have a good idea how much older Xavier is than Scott and Jean or something. He's older than them. He's increasingly not as old as Magneto,
Right.
But Gabrielle Haller is as old as Magneto and doesn't age, and we don't know, you can't explain that one because so this generational thing can't happen, but it can happen with the Morlocks. The Morlocks, you see more of the Morlocks arranging their community and their home life around disabilities than you do the Xavier school, while their head in his childhood home is in a wheelchair, but he can't have a ramp anywhere. There's like this extreme culture with the X-Men of passing at any cost. Like Hank McCoy in his old solo, it was not Amazing Fantasy, what was it called? Amazing Adventure or whatever. There's a scene where he's strapping on this rig to straighten his back and his fake hands and his fake head. And he's telling Warren, like, you have no idea how uncomfortable it is to put all this stuff on to pass. And Warren's like, we shared a dorm room. But that's their culture. And so I think there's a lot of room in that with the Morlocks. I remember the guidebook back in the day when they published that spiral bound guide to the mansion. And they're like, and the mansion has a tunnel that goes directly to the Morlocks. And on like the next page,
tunnel.
they're like, and they have food replicators, just like Star Trek, that will never run out of food. And I'm like, do you run any of that through that tunnel at any point?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I think
yeah. We've removed kind of made them like a classless society in a way. Krakoa tries to do that, make it a classless. And the way they do that is just by ignoring anyone that's infringed upon by classism.
I think
And
that. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, like, speaking of how like Xavier has this mindset of like passing at any cost, it reminds me of this storyline in X-Men with Marrow where like Xavier is telling her she has to learn to withdraw her bones inside of her so that she can pass as human. And that and so she like goes out like to a museum and like the whole time she's withdrawing her bones inside of her. But then finally like it's too physically for her and she has to let go and everyone is like horrified, like the humans are horrified by it. And that just like hit me so hard. Like I think as a metaphor for like pretending to be like heterosexual, but then also like in an autism way, like I guess the term is masking, like hiding your autistic behaviors so that the people around you can feel more comfortable. And it's like the way that it's like physically painful for her, it just hits really hard, I think. And I think it's a really great example of like how Xavier's mindset is like really harmful.
Can I piggyback off that real quick? So that comes into something that I deal with at work called tone policing. Like, as an older individual with autism, 43 years old, white, handsome, like, past, like, I can hold it together. Like, it's taken decades to get to this point of passing. But even when, because I run at a higher cortisol level, a higher adrenaline level, since I'm constantly in a state of anxiety because of I lack solid audio gating, so I can't ignore noises, I can't ignore lights, I can't ignore attention. It what happens is over the course of a day, over the course of an event, you get more and more excited. You're like a cold fish or cold-blooded fish in your environment. When the environment's heating up and getting more energetic, you're heating up and getting more energetic. And often we can lack the ability to tone police ourselves, which is like to control our excitement, or we will choose wording that is more specific, almost asinine, to get the reaction that we want because there's so much specificity that goes into how we think about the words that we use with others because it's not native to us. So we're running through the dialogue of, well, what's the right word in English language that facilitates the best context to the exact chemical temporal experience that I'm having right now. And holding that for a long period of time, like she was saying, is just like really difficult. And eventually you just get exhausted and it just like all comes out like verbal diarrhea. And you do not want to be that person, but you'll have supervisors, you'll have other people around you. You could have communicated this multiple times before. You could have created, you could have explained that you don't necessarily have control of the environment. You don't have control of your chemical reactivity to the environment and the space that you're in. Like you lack that part of autism is often lacking that filter, that ability to ignore all of this tiny little pinpricks of sensory data around you that are overwhelming your cognitive situation. And Sarah was like a great example of that kind of a scenario with her bones, because you are masking and you are doing it just to make other people feel more comfortable, because your normal behavior, your normal infliction, your normal tone of voice, the particular words that you choose are constructed to make them feel comfortable. Very rarely does it have anything to do with your own personal needs and or want desires, which is to not have to engage, to observe, to take your time in interacting with other individuals. You're like forced into that. And to take it one step further with like where I think the Morlocks could be very useful within the X-Men is there's a book coming out called Legion of X, which is not officially a thing that we've read yet and we don't understand. And some people are kind of concerned about where that's going to go with social justice and police and stuff like that within, you know, the Marvel Universe and X-Men in general. For myself, like something I thought would have been fun is taking a group like Leech, Artie, Caliban, Legion, Blindfold, Danny, who have mutations that can be used to track, be aware of different fears, and process through that, and being able to shut off their powers so that they can do that in a constructive, non-dangerous way as like a crisis intervention first responder team. Like that kind of thing. Because the Morlocks really do have that experience dealing with more aggressive and sometimes uncomfortable mutations that the X-Men only pop in and do it and then disappear, and they don't deal with that mutant again. You never see them again. It's like the hero of the day. Like, what's the monster of the week? We're going to save this Morlock, and then we're gone, and you never see them again. But with the Morlocks, it's like every time they do this, they integrate that individual into their society. They find a place for them in their community, and they do it in a way that creates space for them to thrive and be successful and feel like they have potential. I think one of the more interesting characters who's problematic that kind of just went through that is Omega Red recently. Like when the Five were like, hey, we can get rid of their need for that carbonadium synthesizer. Like, we don't need to do that. Like, we can correct that imbalance within who they are. And what do? They weaponize that to use against the individual. And those are kind of like those parallel stories where, like, what are the other options in there? Like, how can characters with mutations work within the community and create space for each other where they can be successful being themselves, where they don't have to mask, where they don't have to withdraw themselves, and where they don't have to compromise their own passions, their own potentials, their own opportunities for the community that they live within. Like, how do we give them that space to succeed?
I'm now thinking of just like a book of just like Morlock social workers. Like they all get like an MSW and like they all get deployed as like community social workers out in the world. But that would be kind of beautiful.
Why not?
I
That's my
would
question.
read the fuck out of the X-Men Finally Get Therapy as a book.
I mean, that's what we're all there for anyway. What we love is, I mean, it's the drama, it's the mental health stuff, it's the hang-ups. So if there was a book that just dealt with that, I think most of the audience would be there.
Yeah. And Paige Guthrie, I think, now has her degree. So like there's at least...
She does. I wasn't going to say it, but I'm just saying.
There's one.
Okay, so I have two questions more for you.
I actually wanted to answer your other question.
Oh. Yeah.
So you had mentioned asking about like kind of where Morlocks can sit in like a queer perspective of it. And one thing that really sticks out to me is the trans metaphor for it. If you're looking at mutants as the queer community as a whole, it is disgustingly common how often trans people are removed from the conversation. It is very common for cis gay people to kind of adopt this mentality of we're getting rights, so we're okay moving forward without worried about the trans people that they are leaving behind. And I think that even more so than the idea of Morlocks are the people who couldn't pass, I feel like Morlocks are the people that are getting left behind. And people, you guys have been mentioning a lot of characters who aren't technically Morlocks. You know, Taki, Chance, Jesse. Comes to my mind are the kids from the Nyx miniseries, where they are not Morlocks, but they are left behind. And I would love to see that narrative told in the Krakoan era, because we are already seeing it. We have Stacy X running a nursery, because both Stacy X and the literal babies that they are required by law to have are being forgotten. And I think that that is an aspect of Krakoa that we need to see more of. And I would love to see it if we see it by the OG Morlocks, and them kind of having this role in Krakoa of making sure that we're not leaving people behind.
I
I
gotta
would
say
just-
one thing.
Just to go back quickly to Callisto and the question of can some of the Morlocks pass? How much can they pass? I think with Callisto, for me, it's not about how she looks necessarily. It's not about her, there's a power radiating off of her. She's the kind of person that probably never shuts up about mutant stuff. It's just that. It's
hands
it's
down.
on her wall behind her. It's on her phone. It's on her T-shirt. It's that kind of thing. She is in her community. She is in her culture, living herself, and that is a way of being left behind in that sense. I think that's a person who then gets cut out of conversations where the respectability mutants don't want that on
Storm
camera.
policing.
She has her "Nobody Knows I'm a Morlock" T-shirt.
Yeah, somebody definitely is out there tweeting, no Morlocks at Pride.
Holy shit!
Oh yeah.
Oh my
yeah.
goodness! I
Yeah,
know that there's another question, but this brought up so much just now.
Sorry, Duda.
Yes. No, it's okay. It's okay. That's what we came here for. I wanted to answer to Gabriel specifically about the point that you have said about like the trans aspect of it. I kind of see it as like I never see things in like only one way. I always try, like my brain always does a lot of things at the same time. It's the ADHD. And like I see it as more of like what happens in the same in this when your body is at the same time within a trans body and in a like and you don't have the resources because like and that is for me that is especially pertinent in the character of Mask when he like changes people's appearances. That's part of his whole deal, and in various interactions between the characters and how they talk about their physical mutations and how they talk about how they would want to be, how and how they learn to be proud of where they are or what they are. It for me sounds like at the same time a very trans thing and a very like poor trans communities thing because these people are not getting no surgery, so like and I think that also like further marginalize them because when you have the resources to make yourself seem cis passing, cis presentable, to make yourself seem one of the majority, it's much more easier to not fall into the things that Morlocks fall in, which in the book pretty explicitly that's homelessness and that's food insecurity and that's a lot of things that like are real for like trans people, for like poor trans people in real life. And so that's where I would like I would never see it only as a trans thing because I feel like yeah the trans community is very marginalized from the LGBT community, but further on the marginalization that the Morlocks suffer within the book has very clear material consequences that probably the people that are making shows about being trans are not getting, at least right now. Some of them yes, because some of them come from there and have gone to a different way, but not all of them, or at least not in the moment where they're telling the trans narratives. It doesn't make sense. So that's one way in which I see like a lot of potential in the Morlocks of like telling a trans narrative that is not like the separation of like I achieved my life, I have my house and my husband or whatever, and my surgeries. and it's very, very different. It's very like about like community and survival. But that's my bit. That's my response. I don't know if anyone wants to piggyback on that.
Definitely. It's interesting because I think about, like, if we're talking about like sub marginalization, so you've got like the trans community, which is marginalized within like the broader like queer community, and then even within the trans community, there is like a power dynamic in terms of who is able to pass and who chooses to pass, and like that has there's like a real, like you said, like a materiality to, and to kind of bring this into what Gabriel was saying, like there's a connection between who's left behind and who passes. And like even just thinking about like media representation of trans people, it's almost always like white, cis passing, skinny trans women. That's like the archetype of like trans representation for a hot minute there. And so even just thinking about like within the trans community, you have this re-stratification of like reduced access to resources if you don't pass, if you don't like, this is something I run into a lot. Like if I don't carry myself the way like a person thinks a trans woman is going to carry themselves, like I immediately become less safe. And I've been rereading this book Going Stealth by Toby Beauchamp. If you want to talk about like the politics of like passing in like a cisnormative society and how that like doles out life chances, amazing book, quick read, can't recommend it enough. But like just this idea that like your ability to meet other people's expectations, even as a member of like a marginalized community, like Hank is the mutant for humans. Like he's a humans mutant. Like he very much checks a lot of the boxes that it takes to be respected by humans as a mutant. And so he's given a level of access to like other teams and other spaces that like most mutants don't get access to, like
Avengers.
Yeah, like he's willing to put those and is able to put those parts of him aside, or to uplift some parts of himself and minimize others to gain access to other spaces and forms of resources that other people don't. And like just thinking about like, even if you gave somebody like Warren the same life chance or the same like resources as Artie and put them in front of humans, like Warren is still.
They try.
What's that?
They try. That's
Yeah.
a storyline.
That's true. That's true.
Callisto tried.
But yeah, it's another layer that I think like the Morlocks have a really good, like if there were trans characters, and then we could ask the question, if there was more than one trans character, like how would that intersectionality of being a trans Morlock be different than like the trans people around Kokroa who, like, you know, if you want to get FFS or like top surgery as a Morlock, like you're gonna be doing some crime to pay for that. But like, you know, X Corp could probably like cook you up some like homebrew HRT that'll work like faster than anything on the market. Or you could always head over to the Crucible or
Mask would be an interesting story
or
to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that would be. Oh yeah, Mask presents an interesting destabilization to what I was just thinking of. See, this is why I would think that the Morlocks are really, really well positioned as this bridge. I also just think like they're the best position to explore actual politics about marginalized communities' experiences, where like they're where the mutant metaphor can have the most impact. Yeah.
You see the vision.
Vision's not a mutant, though.
Oh, interesting mutant, though, which not a lot of people talk about, is he's a mathematical equation.
Integer.
Seriously, brilliant. Like, you want to talk about an interesting mutation, like, and really take it to the next level. Integer is one of those characters that I have an odd aspie fixation on because of my love of math. And I was like, that would be such a cool experience. I'd be integer. I literally would just be a theoretical mathematical formula.
But then you'd
You
have
want to
to
talk
like go
about some
fight
Rockstar
Apocalypse.
X-Force stories? Let's see what's been happening to integer working with X-Force. That would be wild.
I feel like Zorn would love integer, and I don't have much else to say other than I think that Zorn would find integer fascinating to interact
besties,
with.
for sure.
Yeah.
We have to stay on topic. Okay. Has
Sil?
anyone
I think
else?
Sil, were you saying something?
Oh,
I think you're on mute.
I mean not, but we can't hear you.
Can you act it out for us?
Yeah, we can do charades if. Can you say it with dance?
You can if you can go out and back in again, and I'll check if we can hear you then. Okay. So while we wait for Sil, I have 2 last questions. I'm gonna try to make them as quick as possible, but I think one of them. Oh, Sil's here. Okay, now I'll share it.
If you drop it in the private chat, I can read it out to everyone.
Yeah, if that works. And if you want to come later, turn the computer off or do whatever and come later, we'll be here. I'll just go through the next questions and catch you up to date. Does that work? Okay.
Best of luck.
Okay. So the next 2 questions, they're not necessarily put together, but I prefer to put it together because otherwise we're gonna branch over these questions. I know it.
I don't know what you're talking about. We have been so on path this whole time.
We've been on topic. Our topic's just been very broad.
Okay, the first one is, who's your favorite Morlock? You can say more than one. And I think we already have some hints at that, but I want an answer of this is my favorite Morlock. Why? Or these 2 are my favorite Morlocks. I'm saying 2 for no reason. And and the second one is how, and we have already touched on this, so it's not like we can repeat things and we can add new things onto it. How do you think the Morlocks will work now on Krakoa? Because we have talked a little bit about it here and there, but mainly from the perspective of we have always knew them this way, and that crashes with what we're given now in the books. But I want to ask you all, how do you think they will work, or how do you wish they will work? And yeah, that's all too. But I feel like the second one, we already talked a little bit about it, so if you want to skip and just gloss over your fave, that's too.
I'll jump in fast because I did answer both of these already. My favorite is Tommy. Don't know why, she just is. And I would love if the Morlocks could be kind of retold as a way of the mutants left behind. And I think Stacy X needs to be a Morlock. I feel like she never was part of the team, but she fits all the concepts. She's visibly mutated. She's been left behind a lot. She's a sex worker, and I think that her story works so well as a Morlock, much more than it did however we got it back before.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a good way to redeem Stacy X to the fans and get the Chuck Austin taste out of their mouth. How do I think the Morlocks are going to be used? I'm afraid that they're not. They're just going to be forgotten again. They'll be left behind again.
I'll piggyback and say my favorite mutant, or my favorite Morlocks are Callisto and Tommy, and they should kiss. And I would be lying if I didn't say I've scripted like a story about them finding love together on Krakoa. It's just the mix of like high femme and like hard butch energy that they could be bringing to the table together would be it would be magic.
Yes, please.
As far as what I want to see them, I want to see, so first off, I want them to have a holiday where all the Morlocks plan this like annual incursion to Krakoa to just assassinate Sinister. And it's like a thing that they do every single year. And they beat the living crap out of him. And that's just for me. That doesn't need to be something other people enjoy, but that story needs to happen for me. No, I think, like we've said, I really would love to see them shining a light on the problems of Krakoa, because like both in the meta and in the actual story, like Krakoa didn't live up to a lot of its promises that were made initially, and I think that the Morlocks have the ability to show the way that the Krakoa is failing to live up to its reputation in the universe. Like it was positioned as this radical new status quo for the community, but it's really just Xavier's mansion at like the Rainforest Cafe. That's like the only, like, it hasn't really changed the whole lot. It's just there are more vines now. But the problems are still there and the power structures are still there. And so like I think working the Morlocks into and alongside of stories focusing on Krakoa would help to like show where the cracks are in Krakoa, to like show the way it's still not doing what it needs to be doing. I can think of some really exciting people who should do that work. I don't think Marvel is brave enough to like really dig too deep into that narrative and to start criticizing their own work in that way, but I think that there's a lot of potential there. Yeah, I feel like we have covered most of the stuff in terms of how I want to see them used now.
Just to like build on that, maybe like one thing that I think, as you're saying that, interests me is one thing that Krakoa lets you do that didn't previously happen is something I see a lot in the culture now, which is exactly what you're saying, which is like, this is just the mansion at the Rainforest Cafe, but the broader world would say, what are you complaining about? Don't you have everything you wanted? And like, that is also a very familiar queer experience of like, why are you people still complaining? Didn't you get everything? What are these alarms you're sounding? And it's like, the Morlocks let you do that story, right? Like, because one thing about Krakoa versus the mansion is that Xavier got a power upgrade, and now he is one of the world's leading pharmaceutical distributors, right? Like that, like I can't think of too many things that feel cut more to the quick of a betrayal of like 90s queer activism than like, now we control the drug trade, right? Like pointing and underlining just how horrific that is something that really interests me, that the Morlocks could do, right? That they could address the fact that, as is true in the real world, it's like Peter Thiel, like who are my queer representatives now? Like Peter Thiel and like the guy who runs Apple, like queer people are in power now and they're reinstantiating the same models that were oppressing us. And I think a Morlock character lets you think about that. Like someone who does point out like, why the fuck is Mr. Sinister up there? Like a bit more horror about this would be appreciated and enrich the story. My favorite character, as I've already said, is Anna Lee. Mostly because I have a real soft spot for like a sturdy, older, she looks exactly like my grandmother, basically. But I think that increasingly these kinds of stories, for very obvious reasons, the queer community wasn't thinking about its elders in the early 2000s because many of them had died. Yeah. And it's something we need to start thinking about not as a Magneto thing of like this gerontocracy where the people in charge are old people, but what happens when we have to take care of older people whose politics aren't the politics we wish they were, but who are still our responsibility as a community? That interests me as a story.
Can I piggyback right after you? I was going to say, obviously, integer. I just think the idea of a mathematical mutant who's just a concept is just way out there, and I love it. And I think that as far I talked about like the idea of first responder to critical kind of response situations. I think that the Morlocks are really well designed to do that. I just think it's interesting that we haven't gone there yet, but I think that they are the perfect foil by which that could be handled. That's it.
So I like a lot of the Morlocks, and I mean, Callisto's a great character. It's always a better story if Callisto is in it. I really like old school Caliban and Tar Baby, and I have ever since the Krakoa era. I just have this vision of Tar Baby being asked, "Do you want to go to Krakoa?" and being like, instead being like, "No," but Tar Baby is totally cool with everybody coming over to his mom's house to get high and eat pizza. You know, that's because that's the kind of mutants that are hanging out. Those are the Morlocks. I can't see a lot of them, like even the ones that we've seen sign up for Krakoa, like they've got to be weirded out by, we control the drug trade and we invented our own mutant CIA to protect that drug trade in Africa where they don't want us. Like, this has to get weird for some of them. You know, there's some heads in the Morlocks who have spent a lot of time thinking about, they've got it in their head where the CIA has done this in this country and that, and suddenly that's the face of mutant, you know, existence. I don't think we're going to see any of that in any upcoming X-Men books. I think we're going to continue to see one Morlock here, one Morlock there, when their power is either useful as cannon fodder or for some special mission where they've got to assassinate somebody, because that's what X characters do now.
I'm just like thinking, because we've the big pharma of the mutant element has just maybe, I don't know, there's like an interesting line that I'm drawing to like not early, but just like sort of prime era or like golden era AIDS and HIV activism, where like, you know, the very same person who said that like they should drag the like head of the CDC out into the street and shoot them for their negligence towards this epidemic, like met with that same person for dinner to talk about how great they are in terms like in their response to COVID, and like
Cousin Joe of it all.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see the way that like those generational abandonments to, you know, we had this hard political line, but now we're just gonna integrate with like the oppressor system, and you know, if that means having dinner with the folks from Gilead because they're gonna pay us like trillions of dollars to say that, you know, we're not pissed at them right now, like that's good enough. Those types of things.
If I can interject one quick thing, because you all just brought up something that I'm curious. Have you guys read Sabretooth yet?
Yes.
Mole. That is going to be very interesting seeing how that character plays out in the next like 6 months, if you've read that, because he tries to warn everybody, nobody pays attention. He was slaughtered by Sabretooth, and he's such an interesting, like, even in the short bit of time that he's actually gotten in Sabretooth, his commentary on Krakoa was like so transparent and to the point. I was like, okay, somebody gets it. And he's an old school Morlock that we haven't done anything with or seen him forever, but he just like shows up, and I have a feeling he's going to play a very big role in that comic. I think it's going to be interesting. He's getting his little time to shine, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, in a series that like feels very Morlock. Like, I know that Sabretooth
Yeah.
is not a Morlock, and in fact has been hostile towards
Problematic.
them, but it feels and this is where I think, like, I don't know that the Morlocks have ever existed to me as more than like an idea or like a political framework, and not so much like an actual team, but like just the questions that series is raising about Krakoa and about like their quote unquote justice system and like their their commitment to like an assimilationist politic that actually brings them into like larger structures of oppression that, you know, clearly they didn't have too much of a problem with. It's just that they were, you know, these systems were targeting them as mutants, and now that they have the ability to do it, they're happy to use those systems to target other people.
Which was
Regardless of,
Magneto and Xavier's entire idea to begin with.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
That's like where they were like, we're going to flip the script and we're going to take over capitalism. Enjoy.
I mean, there's a reason that when Xavier has his psychic self, he dresses like a conquistador, right?
Oh
shit!
Oh,
where's those jodhpurs when he's?
Whoa!
Where's
He
what's
is
her name?
very-
Sandra Nova's.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah.
Livingston, I presume, jodhpurs when he's talking to Doug. I really liked that actually. That guy sucks.
Maybe there should be a holiday where the Morlocks get him too.
Yeah.
I think that there should be a holiday where everyone gets him.
Yeah.
Well, it's headed by it's Nanny's birthday. It's called Judgment Day, mother. You know.
Yes.
She's got a point.
Okay, who is left for answering the question?
My
Phil.
favorite Morlock is Marrow, and it's because when she joins the X-Men, and then like even before then, like she's always like very queer coded in a way that is really evident, and I think her Morlock background feeds into that a lot, and just like the way that she has this like burning rage and envy towards the other mutants for like being very pretty, and then like how that also is part of that is like her attraction to women, and like her attraction to women is so tied up in her like rage that like they unfairly like they've had like this like privilege that she has not had, and like they're accepted by society in a way that she has never been. And I think it's just really interesting to have like her like queerness be so like deeply intertwined with like this like envy of other women. And like just like speaking personally, like I grew up in like a very white town, and so like there was like a lot of white girls where like I felt attracted to them, but then I also felt like sort of bitter and jealous that like they fit this like ideal of beauty that like I would never be able to fit because I'm not white. And so it's very difficult to like sort out those emotions of like jealousy and bitterness, but then also it's like attraction. And so then that's just why I love Marrow so much, is she really captures like my experience growing up as a lesbian in a way that like not a lot of lesbian or queer characters do for me.
There is definitely something to me that's inherently queer about that internal struggle of, do I want to be you? Do I want you? Or do I want the world to just treat me the way the world treats you? That Marrow personifies so much.
She's like Mini
Marrow and
Callisto in
Bling
Love
have
with
a lot
Storm.
to talk about.
What was that?
She's like Mini Callisto, she sees Callisto's relationship with Storm, and then she's kind of mirroring that as like the younger lesbian who's mentoring by the older lesbian within the community. I mean, I'm old, so maybe I look at it a little bit differently, but when I was coming out in 94, 96, there were no gay men. So all my queer experiences were modeled by women. So that was kind of like an interesting perspective from having seen that kind, because I'm from Maine and it was a very small population, and all my adult queer relationships that I got to model were watching older women kind of in these relationships, and seeing younger women kind of emulating older women was something I never really had, because I just didn't have a lot of older gay men around me at that point in time. And I kind of love that relationship between Sarah and Callisto and Storm, and Sarah and Storm, or Marrow and Storm during the G Nation arc where she stops her heart. And then later when Callisto's, goes through the process with Storm, she has her heart stopped by Storm as well. There's like a lot of long story parallels within the three of those individuals as a whole.
That's like mutant culture right there, apparently. Queer flirting is stabbing someone in the heart.
Said it, not me.
Okay, so who's left? Because I'm bad at keeping track. I think I'm the only
You.
one left. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're the one left.
Okay, so I have two monologues that I really like. I have one that has no reason. So Gabriel, I also love Tommy for like no particular reason. I think it's the aesthetics.
It's the
I
vibe.
I think it's the vibe. I think we want Tommy to be something. And
Okay.
it's like if someone if in some Marvel Prides someone comes up and it's like Tommy actually was trans, I will be like, yes, that's the vibe that I was getting. But I'm not sure like that's gonna actually play out in any way. And also like I think she has been recently like X-Force, something like that. So I'm working more on the idea and the vibes of the character than what's actually being written about her, because like aside from being like the first victim, we don't have a lot of things, and the other things are very practical. So I kind of want to love Tommy more. That's what I'm asking.
It's the aesthetic and the vibe, and if I remember correctly, her hair had a very like pastel trans flag colored scheme to it. So I would not believe if someone told me Tommy was cis.
The first time I opened a comic and I saw Tommy, I was like, wow, this tells me something deep inside. Gonna hide it. But anyway, so
I also love that her name is Tommy. Like, I don't know, you don't see a lot of girls with that name, and that's just fun.
I've always wanted
that be?
I've always wanted Tommy to be Tommy's code name, and then her have like an outrageous real name that no one really has. Like,
see, if she's trans, she has like 7 names. Tommy is just a Twitter handler. But anyway, stereotypes ahead. I also love Skids. She's actually one of my favorite characters, but that happens to me with every character that ends up in New Mutants. They just end up in that book. Louis Simonson writes them, and I'm like, I love these children. And in the case of Skids, I guess it has a personal reason that I feel connects with a lot of things that we have talked about in the show, because I get, and there's no way to know this because these things aren't really like super coded, but I really connect with the Skids in the way she talks and she brings up stuff, the way she stresses herself. I pretty much see her as having ADHD. That's my headcanon. And I also have that headcanon for Rusty. And I think that's why they're best friends. The romantic thing, it's bollocks.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Rusty's whole thing is that he's gay. Like he doesn't want. His trauma is that like he hooks up with that lady and burns her to death, and he didn't even want to.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I feel like they both, like being ADHD babies that bonded over the whole we communicate this weird way, and like they talk a lot and like people make fun of them, and there's this whole thing, they bond a lot over it, they get confused, they think it's romantic, but they're both gay. A story for lives.
Rusty and Skids are the gay man lesbian best friend duo representation we need in the world.
Yes,
Yes.
agreed.
Exactly. So that's why Skids touch my heart. There's very few characters that I read the dialogue and I'm like, I'm so glad someone is as messy as me. Uh, so and that's just here. That touches your heart. But anyway, those were mine. Thank you all for coming so much. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Cinead. Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much. This has been so fun. And I hope I can have you all back again sometime soon. Price.
I promise I'll be on time for that.
Yeah. I'm choosing to believe you. And the DMs for the Brad shows will appear on your DMs on Twitter. But like, yeah, I hope I have you all soon here. We had so much fun, and I don't know. I love covering the Morlocks with you all.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure. I really had a lot of fun today. I learned a lot.
Thank you for
too.
featuring them. It's fun actually seeing them put out front in something and people paying attention to them. I appreciate it.
If Marvel's not gonna.
Yeah, that's the last line, I guess.